Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Bring Me to Life podcast, where we're awakening humanity to spirituality and higher consciousness. My name is Suleiman, and I will be the host for this episode, where we will be interviewing Robert Johnson from the Freemasons podcast called Whence Came You, which is the #1 Freemasons podcast in the world right now. And on this episode, we talk with him about the Temple of Man, how you can see in different architectural significant moments, such as, I don't know, that might not make sense, but such as Solomon's Temple, such as Camelot, etc., etc. We talk about how the body, how man's body, our body, humanity, is related to these different structures. And, you know, before we get into that, we actually talk about what is the Freemasons, and he kind of covers some of the, some people might have some bad assumptions about the Freemasons and the fact that maybe they, worship Lucifer or something like that. So he does actually confront those misconceptions, and from there we talk about the Temple Man. So I think it's a really great episode. I think it's very interesting, and if you are interested in esoteric topics like the chakras, like the divine blueprint, this is a really good episode for you. So thanks for tuning in, and make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. And we'll be right back.
For many of us, spirituality is just the quest to find essence or true meaning, and to really just connect with a higher consciousness.
Welcome to the Bring Me to Life podcast.
Connecting with your spirituality is very important in this life. By becoming mindful of all of that, you can realize where you are, and if that is leading you to where you want to go.
Listen to the little simple things, because it's those little simple things that are going to shift you vibrationally in such a way that will prepare you to become very intuitively minded and ready to step forward on the next part of your path.
I hope you can feel the love that's inside you, it's inside me, that connects us.
Awakening humanity to spirituality and higher consciousness.
All right, and welcome to the show, Robert.
Hey, thanks so much, CeeLo. It's good to be with you today.
Definitely, it's good to have you. So, for anybody who might not know about you or any of the shows that you do, could you please tell everybody who you are and what your purpose is?
Sure. So basically, I got started, podcasting in 2012, 2013, on the topic of Freemasonry. I had joined the Masonic fraternity in 2008, and basically was really interested in the teachings, kind of the esoteric teachings, the philosophies behind the order. So I started a podcast because there were a lot of gentlemen, actually Masons, who don't always get to go to lodge meetings. They don't always get to study. They don't always have time to read the research papers and things of that nature. So I just figured I would start reading those research papers, start reading those esoteric and philosophical researches, and then it kind of evolved into doing interviews, and so about 5 years later, here we are. And so currently I produce one Masonic podcast called Whence Came You, which is the #1 Masonic podcast in the world, which is pretty cool for a niche subject like Freemasonry. And then we also I co-produce with 4 of my best friends another Masonic podcast called the Masonic Roundtable. And people ask, well, what's that? And it's kind of like The View, only it's 5 guys discussing the fraternity, our issues that we're having within the fraternity, as well as having educational topics on several different things. And we've dabbled with some other Masonic podcasts as well. Masonic Radio Theater was one we did for a while, which was entertainment value based around Masonic lore and legends. And on to writing. So I'm a managing editor of a website called midnightfreemasons.org, where we publish about 3 new Masonic articles every single week. So it's probably the #1 Masonic blog out there, next to Brother Chris Hodap's blog. He's the fellow who many of your listeners, if they've ever listened to, or if they've ever read any Masonic books, they had an interest in it, may have come across Brother Hodap's book, which was Freemasonry for Dummies. So he runs a really cool blog, and he did a great job in that book in explaining the fraternity to what we would call the profane or the uninitiated. And a lot of men have read that book and gone on to join the fraternity because of the good information and the positive values that the book portrays. But
Nice.
That's kind of where I come from. So
Very cool. Well, congratulations on the popularity of your Freemason podcast. Definitely.
thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think the Freemasons is something that a lot of people have heard about, but there's so many kind of different, kind of mixed reviews, I guess, about the Freemasons.
Yeah, that's true.
Could you, I guess, explain to our listeners what exactly does it mean to be a Freemason and what's involved in the Freemasons?
Sure. So in the last few years, I guess, there's been an increased interest in the fraternity based on the popularity of a couple things. You had the National Treasure movies where Harvey Keitel wore his Masonic ring and they protected some treasure, this treasure of antiquity. And the other was, of course, Dan Brown's book, The Lost Symbol, which dealt heavily with Freemasonry, and even got a little bit of controversy because the next movie that we expected to come out with Tom Hanks, actually, they skipped over The Lost Symbol, and there was some conspiracy about why they did that. But in truth, it's just because it's really hard to film in Washington, D.C., where that book is supposed to take place. But what's really the fraternity of Freemasonry has been around in an organized fashion, I should say, meaning we took records of who came to the meetings and when people got degrees. And that all started right around 1717 or 1721. So we are technically the world's oldest fraternity. There is, of course, a lot of criticism that goes along with Freemasonry. Outsiders will be quick to point out many times that the fraternity is men only and it's not progressive and they don't allow women. Or they'll say we don't have windows on our buildings, and that we've been accused many times of satanic worship and these kind of things. But in truth, a lot of the religious dogma that gets pushed onto the Masonic fraternity, like we're somebody who worships Satan or Satanists or something, is just false. The doctrine that they push on the Masonic fraternity in that manner is based on Leo Taxil, who was a not so cool of a guy back in the day, and he falsely claimed, he took words out of context, much like in today's media, where you can take any politician and the news agency will cherry pick statements and portray what somebody said in an off-key manner. And so this happened in a book called Morals and Dogma, written by Brother Albert Pike, in which he was talking about Lucifer as the morning star. And Leo Taxil basically said that Masons worshipped Lucifer, or the the morning star. And this wasn't true. In the book, proper context was Albert Pike was saying the morning star, the true Latin meaning of Lucifer, light bearer, and the light bearer of the world, in Albert Pike's eyes, he was a Christian, so the light bearer of the world was Jesus Christ for him. He was saying that Jesus was the light of the world in the true Latin terms. And so Leo Taxil took this all out of context and basically wrote all this stuff, and it was just absolutely outrageous. It went all over the country, and it actually formed the nation's first third party, political party, which was the anti-Masonic party. And later on, Leo Taxil actually confessed that he made it all up. But of course, that doesn't make sensational news media. So, and ever since, religious organizations have consistently had, reservations about the Masonic fraternity, calling it incompatible, which is unfortunate because Masonry is not a religion. It is a religious organization in that it asks its members to practice the faith of their choice and to be diligent in practicing of that faith. So that's one area which is interesting. You get Hindus, you get Jews, you get Catholics, you get Christians, just about any religion you can think of. They can join Freemasonry, which is interesting. There are a lot of organizations that don't support the mixing of faiths under one roof, but in the fraternity of the Masonic fraternity, it happens every single day. And we pride ourselves on the diversity and the culture that we have so much of. Like I said, unfortunately, we get some bad press every now and again because, the old rumors persist. But it is interesting, Our other criticism, of course, is that some people think, where does Masonry stand in the 21st century? We are we're what we call a progressive moral science, where we teach morals and philosophies that are what we would call absolutes. If you ever take Philosophy 101, right, we can talk about absolutes and prima facie values. Things that might not always be true, but it depends on the context. But what we try to teach in our fraternity is these three tenets of brotherly love, relief, and truth, based on faith, hope, and charity. Charity being this idea of agape, the original Latin term for the universal love of God or the creative force of the universe or whatever that is for you toward our fellow creatures, whether they be man, woman, black, white, straight, gay, doesn't matter. And we are that progressive. There are some organizations within our fraternity that recently actually got some bad press because they upheld some very, I would call them, evangelical Christian ideals, and coincidentally, other Masonic organizations cut ties with those organizations because of their decisions to be non-inclusive. So we are a really cool organization in terms of what we do and what we stand for. In base of what it is exactly we do is we bring men into a fraternity, and in some cases, I should mention there is really two sides to our organization versus what we call regular Freemasonry. So this is every single state in the United States has a Grand Lodge who oversees the many lodges in the different states. So I live up in Chicago, and in the state of Illinois, there are about 468 lodges in Illinois. So what's interesting is we all report up to the Grand Lodge, and they handle all of our, because we're technically a 501c10 organization, we're charitable. And we all kind of filter up to that Grand Lodge, and we have some core tenets that make us what we consider regular, as far as we can call it irregular or clandestine or regular. So what makes us regular and able to converse with other lodges and visit other lodges is this idea of regularity. And so for a lodge to be regular, they have to have a certain set of rules, which is that they follow the same ritual guidelines as all the other lodges, that they basically have the same, a lot of the same verbiage, and that they admit men only, which is interesting in today's day and age, actually. In Colorado, there are, I should say around the United States, there are actually 2 organizations which regular Masons would call clandestine or irregular, and that's because they admit women and men into one lodge. Those would be Ledroit Humane and the American Federation of Human Rights. And both organizations are equally really cool. And I've actually had the privilege to speak with members of both of those organizations and visit with them and talk with them. And they're the same. They just admit women, which I think, in the next 20, 30 years, CeeLo, that you're going to see that I think women are going to be allowed probably in regular Freemasonry as well.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to ask, is if you think this is like a progressive trend that will continue throughout the organization.
I think so. Something that is so, as you know, I'm sure you and your listeners are aware, I've listened to several of your episodes, and one thing that I have to say that is so commendable on your part is you guys' ability to be so accepting and to listen to the multifaceted sides of everybody's beliefs and practices. And that's so important today when we're talking about how can we ever get to the utopia we all want, where we can live and love each other for who we are and be there for everybody. It's really important to have that understanding, to be tolerant, but not to be tolerant of intolerance. And I think that's something else that our fraternity has and is growing to embrace that. Because the organization was so staunchly Christian in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, you find a lot of that evangelical Christian or idealism still holds very true, especially in the southern parts of the United States. There were some issues over the last few years where actually the Grand Lodge, which is like the main lodge of the state of Arkansas, actually issued a ban of any man who was homosexual. They were kicked out of the fraternity, and much to the upset of so many brothers in our fraternity, they even went so far as to issue statements saying, you can't even talk about the fact that we did this. Well, that really backfired. I mean, this is the age of the internet, right? And so what is the one thing we all did? We all were up in arms over this. How can you do this? This is absolutely ridiculous. These are good men. You cannot, you're supposed to judge a man based on his character and his good works, not what goes on in his private life. The idea that sexuality is really something that's only been the concern of anybody else in the last couple hundred years, right? It's really kind of interesting. Before, ancient Rome, men had companions, women had companions. This wasn't an issue. Only in this, I think, kind of overzealous areas, within a lot of the religious areas is where this happens. So what happened, though? A lot of the Grand Lodges, I think 5 or 6 of the Grand Lodges in the United States, including some Grand Lodges overseas, issued statements saying they are now not recognizing the Grand Lodge of Arkansas. And their the members in Arkansas aren't allowed to visit their lodges in their states. California was one. There were Washington, D.C. was another. The Grand Lodge of the State of Illinois issued a very strong statement condemning the actions. So you can kind of see how there is movement in the positive, and change takes time, especially with a fraternity like ours. But overall, a wonderful organization.
Yeah. And so I kind of would like with that to sort of get into our show topic, which is, I believe, the temples of man. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that relates to how the Freemasons got started. Sure.
So the idea of the Temple of Man, I should preface this really with saying that the organization of the Masonic fraternity today does not have the same focus on philosophical and esoteric research as it once did, say, prior to the First World War. We had a large influx of members who largely changed how the fraternity worked and operated. But what then happened was members within the fraternity started finding other outlets, other clubs, other organizations, philosophical research groups, so that we could still meet and talk. And largely this still happens today. So you have a lot of appendant bodies and organizations that do a lot of interesting extracurricular studies. There's Martinist groups. There are Rosicrucian orders, many types of spin-offs. But the basis, it is the belief of not just myself, but several Masons, probably in the millions, believe that there is this idea of the teaching of the temple, or the body of man is the temple. So we have what we call an allegory. Anybody who might not know what that is, it's just a fancy, antiquated word that means a story. And so we teach these allegories through degrees. And these degrees are plays where the candidate, so if you, CeeLo, if you were going to go have a first degree, they would tell you, you're going to be part of a play. And you're the star, but you don't know your lines. But don't worry, you're going to have somebody there to talk for you, and you just have to sit and listen and take this in, right? And so these degrees build on each other. Your first, your second, and your third, which is your Master Mason degree. Contrary to what a lot of people think, there is no degree higher than a third degree Master Mason. There are appendant bodies which confer additional degrees, like the York Rite, which will give you your 4th through your 12th or 13th degree. And then there is a Scottish Rite, which goes from your 4th all the way up to a 32nd and even an honorary 33rd degree. And there, over time, there are actually over 1,000 different degrees being worked since the 1500s, I should say. Many of which came out of France in the 1800s. But the third degree allegory, which was first written and recorded in the 1720s, really dealt with a story of a builder and the building of King Solomon's temple. And what's interesting about that is a lot of the symbolism, because things aren't just laid out for you. There is a surface level to things, and there's the underlying level. Like if somebody watches The Matrix for the first time, they're going to think, cool movie. They watch it maybe a second and a third time, and they see these underlying tones, programmed realities, how, being aware of oneself, man is God, right? These kind of things. And again, this is not the teaching of Masonry, but it is it is stated in many educational books printed by Grand Lodges that the allegory of Solomon's temple is the human body. We talk about building a temple, and this relates to the temple of your mind, stripping your mind of the vices and superfluities of your life. Things that tend to occupy your mind that might not be the best choice of action, to always be productive, to do the internal work to make yourself a better man, to study the philosophies and do these things. And if you want to think about it in a certain way, these lessons, the philosophies that you would just read perhaps by picking up Plato or Aristotle, those can all be thought of as rough stones. And as you study them, you're chipping away at those stones, making them perfectly fit for you, for the building or your mind. And esoterically, this can come back to the even a more interesting idea, that is, of course, the idea that the human body is in and of itself the temple of man, right? I mean, the body is a temple. What is the body outside of a biological machine? A machine made of flesh and blood that somehow our consciousness is at the helm of, or sits inside this cockpit that we don't know where it is. Maybe it's the pineal gland, maybe it's something else. But what you start to find, or I'll quote one of my co-hosts, Frater O, who consistently uses the phrase shocking correlations. You find shocking correlations when you start laying out the Temple of Solomon over the human body. And this is something that any one of your listeners or readers can actually look up online. You can Google search Solomon's Temple, human body, and you can just get blown away. And this is what's interesting about the entire concept of how we treat our bodies, whether it's holistic healing or making sure you get the proper nutrition. All of these things is we come in and we have to think about what we're putting in our bodies to essentially make them what they're supposed to be, these special vessels, right? So this is kind of the idea of the temple of man, the idea that man's body, and when I say man, I mean the general scope of humanity. I'm not being sexist. I'm not cutting out women. I'm just saying man is in the general species, Homo sapiens sapien. So the idea that our bodies are holy unto themselves. You can read in the various holy books of any faith that, so if you read perhaps the Pentateuch which is the 5 books of Moses, in the beginning of this, he references Elohim. He uses the word Elohim for the word God, but that's plural. So Elohim is plural. It says Elohim, made man in their image. Who is there? Who are these gods? So if we are made in their image, we are them. We are holy unto ourselves. The idea that almost every single religion in the world, the Dalai Lama once said, I'll paraphrase here, something along the lines of, all religions lead to the center point. It's like a wagon wheel. And depending on that path, what is at the center? And when you really start digging deep, I mean really digging in, you start realizing that the real hidden truth, and I'm not giving anything away here, this is not necessarily Masonic or anything else, but the idea that nothing really exists without the man's conscious mind perceiving of it existing. And to this end is man its own God. The idea that we can think it, we create it, we make it happen. You can go even further with this, looking at the ideas of The Secret. If you or any of your listeners have ever read that book, fantastic book, a great documentary. It's a little infomercial-ish, but as far as the documentary goes, but it is this great idea. One of their stories, a man who was in a plane crash was never going to walk again, they said. And he said to himself that he would walk by Christmas. It was like 9 months away. He said it. He had a determination to do it, and he did it. this idea that the all-powerful mind, if you can tap into that resource and really hone your existence, the possibilities of what the human can do are, limitless, essentially. I'm not sure if you ever had anybody on the show that might talk about some things like perhaps esoteric anatomy or the hidden anatomy of man.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of ideas, and if you search online, we'll have a book coming out probably in the next year or so, which is going to be a really basic, written at a 5th grade level kind of anatomy book, which will go over a lot of the ideas, the symbolism behind a lot of these maps that you'll find online. Like if you type in Temple of Man in a Google search, God help you trying to process what's there. You'll see an outline of a man, and there'll be all these conflicting ideas of yin and yang and Zoroastrianism and Judaism and Catholicism and just astronomy, and chakras, everything just blasted up on this thing. And what we realize by looking at a map like this is that, again, all of these religions, all of these systems, these secret schools tend to lead toward that center point. They all have, they're all an archetype for something else. Just like, you can say Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, and Hermes Trismegistus, and Thoth, all these great teachers of antiquity and time, that were written about in mythologies and time before time. They're all the same real person. I mean, in that they're these great teachers of these cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same idea where, chakras line up with the Kabbalistic tree of life. How is that? I mean, that's just wild and crazy. Why is that? Well, it's probably because there's something there. And it all leads back to, this idea of the Temple of Man. Its closest scientific relevance would be something like the chakras lining up with, the different glandular systems within the scientific body. I mean, science says we have a glandular system, right? So it's really interesting when you start looking at chakras and how they line up. They all correspond to the different, or to the glandular system, which is just mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So this, you said if you kind of overlay the, I think the blueprint of Solomon's temple compared to the human body and you're talking about symbolism and stuff like that. Is there certain points in the temple that have symbols that kind of relate to maybe to a chakra or to something else within
Sure.
this?
Yeah, so like one of the interesting things, if you look at the idea of Solomon's temple, maybe that's the Eastern philosophy. What's the Western equivalent? Could be Camelot. Some idea of a perfect building. You can look at your pineal gland. When you lay that over, when you lay out the body of man with the Solomon's temple over the top of it, and this isn't a view again held by everybody, but you'll notice certain things like the pineal gland is supposed to be, it's written about in esoteric texts as a place where, by accessing it properly, there's a lot of people going out there, they're doing these spirit trips and doing ayahuasca and doing all this stuff that really activates dimethyltryptophan or DMT, which activates your in your pineal gland. And there's some loose research that said that your pineal gland is what produces dimethyltryptophan naturally in your body. Well, whenever somebody activates that stuff, they talk about the visions and being somewhere, and they all describe the same things. Well, what's interesting about that is you lay the body over the Solomon's temple, and you'll see that the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to be, is right in line with the pineal gland. And the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to be, it wasn't just a box that held the Ten Commandments and Aaron's rod and all these religious artifacts, the two angels, or they call them cherubim, on the top are said to have been literally the seat of God on earth. And if you look at, so where that sits, you start making these correlations about man's mind, the seat of God. How does that really start to look? You look at chakras, specifically, the crown chakra, Keter or Kether, however you'd like to pronounce it. There's, if you take the Kabbalistic tree of life and you overlay that too, you start seeing where these chakras line up with the Kabbalah, which is, of course, a Jewish mysticism piece. And I'd be more than happy to as well. As part of the episode, I can send you a few images that would accompany it, and for you guys to study, and for anybody who would like to do some further research.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely include that in there for sure. So, what do you think? Okay, so you're saying that this information, when you kind of look at the human body and see how everything is corresponding to it, that by looking into this, you're getting onto that thing of all paths lead to the same center?
Yeah. So you can look at just about any philosophical system, like I said, whether it's Rosicrucianism or Catholicism. Well, I shouldn't say Catholicism totally. You'd have to look at maybe the idea of Gnostic texts within these Christian Gnostic texts written by Essenes, or any one of the multifaceted, or I shouldn't say multifaceted, any one of the multiple Gnostic organizations that came out of ancient Judea. But I would say every kind of culture around the world seems to have what I would call a secret school of wisdom. So in Judaism, it's Kabbalah. In ancient Greece, you had the Pythagoreans who studied the pentagram and the five. Certain religious groups like Zoroastrianism, and again Gnosticism, Egyptian mystery schools. If your listeners are so inclined, there's a great book by a Mason. His name is Manly P. Hall. He wrote a fascinating book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which he actually wrote before he was a Freemason. He was a great esoteric leader, I guess, of thought, I would call it. And he wrote a book called The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, which is really interesting. He dives a little bit into a Egyptian mystery school, or an Egyptian rite. It follows the path of a young priest becoming a high priest in the Egyptian rites and rituals. But again, it's like an onion, so it has lots of layers to it. And it's a very short book, which is great. You've got your later Greek mystery schools. Again, Rosicrucianism, which is pretty heavy in Masonry. The idea of alchemy, spiritual alchemy. On the surface, you've got these ideas of lead into gold. But really, what does that really mean? What does lead really mean? Does that really mean just a basic man, and the gold is the apotheosis of man? Excuse me.
It's all very, very interesting stuff to think about. And is this esoteric information and the Temple of Man and stuff like that? Is this stuff that you cover on your own podcasts?
It is. So every other week or so, like I mentioned or kind of alluded to earlier, these are not beliefs that are held by all Masons. But all Masons will acknowledge that there is a deeper significance to what we talk about and what we do. And like anything, it's really about the individual's ability to use his own perceptions and to do his own internal work and research to realize his own truths. And so because of that, not everybody has the same flavor. There are guys who really just like the historical aspect of our fraternity, or our craft as we call it, where we can talk about things like the historical aspects of colonial Freemasonry. When Freemasons first came over into the United States, our influence on our governmental system, our influence in the day-to-day happenings of colonial America. Or every other week, I have a really good friend of mine come on. We just call him Frater O. O is his last name. Frater is just means brother in Latin. So he'll come on, and we'll talk about esoterics very heavily, where we will go in and we talk about things like diet, exercise, the proper ways of meditation, the absolute necessity to become better is through meditations. We talk about a lot of the interesting things that we've gone through in our personal lives, where we have a real issue with something, and how meditation and guided meditations really pull us through. So there is a good deal of esoteric talk on the program as well. We've got 268 episodes, of which probably 90 or so are very heavy in the esoterics.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Cool. Well, definitely appreciate having you on our show personally, and I think this is all, good things for people to start looking into, and, it's definitely something that I appreciate thinking about. Where can people find more information about you and some of your shows?
Sure. So if anybody would care to, you can visit WCY, like Whence Came You, WCY podcast.com. And from there, you can pretty much find links to everywhere that I am and I'm going, my speaking schedule, things of that nature. The other website you can check out is something called theMasonicRoundtable.com, and that's pretty unique. We actually go live, and we do a podcast live every Tuesday night at 10/9 Central, where we go live, we talk about a topic, and then we refer back to social media to see what people are saying, and we answer questions right there live on air. And then the episodes for that are live on in perpetuity through YouTube and the glorious wonders of the internet. So it's a pretty good deal. It's very much similar to your program, how you guys have yours laid out on your website as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for being on our show today, Robert.
Hey, CeeLo, it was an absolute pleasure. And again, if anybody has any questions, you can always just reach out to me on Facebook or on Twitter at Whence Came You. I really appreciate the time.
Definitely. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Thanks for shining on with us.